so many things, like how to love and how to lose and how to choose.
Well, hello, this is Linda Carbonell, and welcome to a special edition of Walking Through Life. And today I have two guests. I have Stephanie Waterman.
Waterman,
right,
yes.
Who's from GrowPro. And so we're going to be discussing some of that with her. But then we got Lieutenant David Zuckerman. Thank you so much for coming. And I think what we've discussed a little bit is that I kind of wanted to share my story to kind of like try to fight a little bit of stigma, but also get you guys' thought about that. So the one thing that I have suffered from years is I fell off a trampoline and fractured a skull, and then my neck was crushed. So the first diagnosis they gave me was 3 herniated discs there. And so that was 10 years ago, I think it was. And so I went to the pain clinic and had all kinds of tests. They said, well, let's try injections. I tried injections. Did not work. And then they gave me a Lanoderm patch, which worked some but didn't really help. So and then we talked surgery, and they can't do surgery on like hernia discs that are on top of each other. And then with degenerative, of course, you have other hernia discs within yourself and bone spurs and all that kind of stuff. Plus, unfortunately, I do have PTSD too. So, and mental health is my disability. Right. So I've always been somebody that's wanted to get better, to figure out how to really change my life. Was on Vicodin starting 10 years ago. Right. And another reason I wanted to stop too is because it was affecting my brain really bad, after that amount of time. And so, and then I started researching other people and how they were able to transfer from opiates down to, well, I don't say down to because marijuana's number one, right?
Cannabinoids and so forth, yeah.
Yeah, but there's so much of a range there. And I can remember telling my doctor, so the first thing we needed to work on was getting off the Vicodin. And I thought about it and how hard it was going to be. So I went over to GrowPro and talked to Stephanie and Kendall. And so they walked me through what CBD was and actually walked me through how to do it to get off opiates. And I'll tell you, the hardest part of that whole thing was 2 weeks. That's it. And I had the CBD, so I was able to relax, and be okay with it, just accept. Because sometimes you just have to accept that in order to get better, you have to go through the hard stuff first, and that's addiction. Yep. You know what I mean? Yeah. And even though I wouldn't call myself an addict of the Vicodin or whatever, I didn't want to be so that I could,
Well, if your body had those cravings and you were going through that difficulty, that's part of what addiction is. And
yeah, well, yeah, because
I'm glad you're able to push through that.
Right, and it was important to me too because it was affecting my brain so much. I mean, 9 years of use, even though it's doctor worked with the doctor or whatever. So I was able to get off it with the CBD, which worked right for me because I had to wait a month to be off the Vicodin before I could apply. And so I talked to it was wonderful. It was like, it didn't kill the pain all the way, but I'll tell you, I was able to get off the medication. Plus, I still use CBD today for inflammation and all of that, along with my concern, I think, was the long process. And when we're talking, this is what I think, when we're talking about legalizing marijuana, can you imagine everybody that cannot get on medical marijuana? The criteria is pretty big. You got to have 2 diagnoses, and yeah.
That's quite a process, and
yes,
some of the options for where to get it are limited, so sometimes medical cannabis is geographically or financially hard to get. So there's still a lot of challenges in the medical cannabis system.
Exactly, yeah.
It has been interesting with the real growth in the CBD production, both in terms of growing, which you could certainly talk a lot more about, both indoors and even some knowledge of outdoors, I'm sure. But also, as CBD has become more available to people to use for some of the persistent achy joints, or as a sleeping aid for insomnia, or a wide range of other things far beyond my knowledge, it's become much more acceptable, I think we were talking earlier, to really talk about it and say, wait a minute, you can go with over-the-counter or prescription drugs for a lot of these things that, government helps pay for, insurance helps pay for, and so forth through that sort of rigmarole. Or you can have something that's a plant that if grown in a healthy way without herbicides and pesticides, can also help people either not start using some of those opiate persistent painkillers, or even in some cases alleviate having been on them to move off.
Yep.
And there's still a lot of research going on there. They've not statistically shown and proven that this is absolutely the right thing and perfect for everybody who's gone on various opiates, whether it's Oxycontins and Vicodins and others. But there's just, I hear stories all the time, partly because I've stuck my head out there politically on this topic. People constantly telling me stories like yours of having really, not intentionally, but gotten onto this path with a persistent pain problem, been prescribed these drugs, and then found that actually they're stuck on these drugs.
Yeah,
and,
not only that.
They don't want to be.
Right. Like what happened to me was it just sort of went from helping to not, you know. And one other thing I wanted to say about CBD too is my husband and I both suffer from mental illness. So he's got schizophrenia, but he also got some nerve problems in his legs. And he took schizophrenia. He sleeps better. He's not as restless, and you know his legs feel a little bit better and stuff. And so that's important to me. I mean, I think we need to look at the benefits for the mental health system here for CBD.
Well, I think there's a lot of research to be done, and we were talking earlier about some of the legal impediments to some of the research around so many potential opportunities, and we were also talking about the complexity of CBD itself. Well, there's 300 or 400 different substrains.
Right.
And in the recreational cannabis world, there's two whole families, indica and sativa, and then within those, there's numerous strains. So as a farmer, I sometimes make a parallel of, with tomatoes, a lot of people think there's basically one variety of tomato, and unfortunately we've lost, hundreds and hundreds of varieties of most of our plant species. But the reality is, anybody who's been to a farmer's market knows you've got, dark purple, almost black tomatoes, you got green tomatoes, you got red tomatoes, you got big ones and small ones and golden ones. And so the same is true with the hemp plant.
Absolutely.
And maybe the different traits and strains that are in them. And I'd love to know more what you know about that world.
Well, it's interesting because
you have a lot of knowledge. You guys do. I mean, you really helped me a lot.
Yeah, well, there's so many people that come into our store. We started carrying CBD about 2 years ago now because we've seen the medical benefits. And there are so many people who come in and have stories very similar to yours, and CBD has helped them get more active or get off their pain medications, has helped family members.
It's amazing.
The two biggest things people use it for really are pain and inflammation and anxiety, depression. Those are the two biggest things that people coming into my store are using it for. So I think there is a lot of potential in the mental health arena, and hopefully as we're moving through legislation, we can open it up to researchers because,
That's
with the way that cannabis is scheduled on the federal level, it makes doing studies challenging. Israel is actually kind of leading the way in cannabis research at the moment, and they have some great stuff coming out of there. And there is some data out there, but it's hard to find, and our medical community is not connected to that.
And it's pretty, in some corners, it's pretty reticent to even become connected. I don't know if that's from decades of the relationship of the pharmaceutical industry with the medical community. I don't think it's an intentional on the part of the medical community, but there's become this sort of faith that the pharmaceutical representatives and industry, give you the best information for your patients, and this, the plant world is, that's old sort of witch doctor-y stuff. But what's interesting is when you look at most pharmaceutical medicines, many of them have been derived from those same witch doctors, for lack of a better term, or those I can't remember the word right now because I'm blanking out, but actually sort of sage leaders in the communities who used the plants and knew which plants to use for certain ailments. And it was the properties of those plants that we've now exploited to then make in labs as pharmaceuticals. But the hemp plant, cannabis plant, really has a lot of potential.
It does, and there's a lot changing nationally, with the states that have legalized, including Vermont. And we just this past summer, in the last few months, had a FDA approval for a CBD drug on the market. It's ridiculously overpriced. You can buy CBD over the counter for a lot less.
Yep.
But they, claim that with the co-pays through insurances, it may be less expensive. But to me, it's just an example of the pharmaceutical industry inflating
That's what I say. Yeah,
their
that's
prices.
what I say too. Yeah. And you know what else? I forgot to tell you this when I was telling my story. I've been able to get off my anxiety medicine, Seroquel, completely off that. And I've also been able to come down one pill on my sleep medication, which is, I mean, it's
Fantastic.
like I go to bed at 9 o'clock, I wake up early, feels
Well, that
good.
brings up a couple things for me, and I was using the term witch doctor earlier, partly to like inflame the situation, but herbalists, you know, and
Yeah.
folks like that who are not witch doctors. They are smart people that are using plant medicine. But as you mentioned, some of the medications you're getting off of, it brings it back to part of the world I'm in, which is this political world, and what is this system, and what are all the expenses from the pharmaceutical industry. And part of it is the regulations in producing those drugs is very high, so that drives some prices up, although in Europe and in Canada, many of the prices are lower. So it is not all regulation, even though some people want to paint it as that.
Right.
But the other part is government does help support many people's medication through Medicaid, Medicare, veterans, and some of these systems are so much more expensive than a plant like this can be. And so you've talked about the different medications you've been coming off of. And, I have no idea how much government subsidized or not your medicines. But if you take that to the 300 million people we have in this country and whatever number of those are on these various medicines, government helped subsidize for good reason. People needed to be cared for with medication. We're talking about millions, if not billions of dollars across the country of tax dollars and everything else that doesn't need to be spent.
Exactly.
And can be saved for taxpayers.
Right.
And yet those regulatory hurdles, and you talked about the need for the research. Well, because we talked about this earlier before the show, that under the Nixon administration, politicians made cannabis plant a Schedule I drug, which means there is no medical benefit at all. And that wasn't done for political reasons, because Richard Nixon was trying to suppress the anti-war movement and wanted to suppress the civil rights movement. And those are a great way to get folks put into jail or criminalized. And so they made it a Schedule I drug, whereas normally at the governmental scientific research place where the FDA, where they determine Schedule I, it's based on science. And this was a political decision not based on science. And it's been decades of propaganda from even before Nixon that we're now dealing with dismantling in these conversations, and folks like yourself coming forth and saying, wait a minute, you know, the prescription drug was far worse for me than this CBD product that I'm getting from a responsible producer.
And there's still a stigma attached to cannabis.
There is.
Even with legalization. We legalized July 1st for recreational use in the state. You can't buy it or sell it, but you can grow your own. So that's where a store like mine comes in. If you have the ability to buy into a situation where you can grow your own, because it's not inexpensive. There is a buy-in involved, and not everyone can do that, and not everyone has the ability to grow their own. So we had a cancer patient who we were working with at the store, and she was buying her maximum allotment of cannabis every month from the dispensary, and she was spending $3,000 a month. There's absolutely no subsidy for that. It's all cash out of pocket. And she couldn't get enough to make the medicine she needed because she wasn't able to smoke it. She had to process it into oil, and you need more. And we were trying to help her to be successful home growing. But she was very, very sick and not able to do the work involved. And her husband was trying, and we ended up getting them hooked up with a consultant who was in their home helping, and it was sad. A couple of weeks ago, her husband came into the store and told us she had passed away. And she's been very inspirational for us in the cannabis community, thinking of how can people who do successfully home grow help other people who need it. If there were some way where we could have like a donation bank or something for the overages that people have, and I hope to see that.
Gifting is okay.
To gift, and so those are things I'm working on with other members of the cannabis community. How can we set up a system to help people?
Oh, that's so nice.
Because when you cancer patients especially need significant amounts to do treatments with oil and things
Right,
like
especially
that.
if they're processing it.
Yeah. You know, but not everyone has the ability to grow for themselves, and that's why I hope, you know, to see our state go the step further and get to a tax and regulate market, so that people who maybe don't qualify for the medical cannabis system, you know, but have a valid
Or
condition.
don't own their property, so a landlord might not let them grow.
Exactly.
Or don't have the land, even if they do have their own property, or they don't have the resources, or they don't have the green thumb. You know, some people can grow flowers, some can't.
Exactly.
Some can grow vegetables, some can't.
Yes.
You know, some can grow cannabis well, and some can't.
Exactly.
No, I've been a long proponent, as I think you both know, of changing our laws towards a legal and regulated market system, and for a lot of reasons, though. Not just, hey, everyone wants to smoke. In fact, that's the least reasonable reason.
Sure.
Right.
Youth prevention. Right now,
Exactly, yeah.
drug dealers don't check your ID.
Absolutely not.
They don't have a quality control standard of, is it clean of herbicides or pesticides, or worse, clean of other drugs to be tainted with. There are people that even really, not many do this, but there's particularly bad apples that even sprinkle small lead bits into it to make a bag heavier.
Yeah.
And then you're smoking or consuming lead, which is like, hello, we've been working on that for decades, since the 70s, taking it out of gasoline. And so it isn't really about that this is a good or bad product. It's about taking an underground market, bringing it above board, making it cleaner, making it so that people going to a store, you have to show an ID even to go into a store in these other states, and actually reducing some youth access. It's not going to eliminate it by any means.
No.
Not totally.
But, and then on top of that, we were talking also about the business side, the economic development side.
Absolutely.
Right now, that's an underground economy. Those people don't pay income taxes on it.
Nope.
It's not adding to the tourism economy. It's not adding to the, I think we talked about HVAC jobs. We talked about
electricians.
all kinds, electricians and accountants, and all of this should be above board.
Absolutely. You know, the state hired the Rand Corporation, you know, maybe back in 2014.
4 or 5 years ago now.
You know, it was a while ago, to do a study on cannabis use in Vermont. And they found that we were anywhere from $125 to $250 million a year cannabis habit in the state of Vermont. We happen to have the second highest per capita cannabis use in the nation, you know, second to Colorado. And so if you think about that, even on the low end, $125 million a year, you know, where is that money going? A lot of the underground cannabis in the state is coming from legal states like California or Colorado. You know, certainly some of it's being grown here, you know, but a lot of it is imported. And so that money then is going out of our state, out of our economy, instead of going to a farmer in our state who then is spending that money on groceries and their heating bill and buying their kids, you know, shoes for school. So there's so much economic opportunity that's being lost.
Actually, even more recently, the Joint Fiscal Office said the economic activity generated by an above-board market would now be closer to 350 to 400. I think it's $368 million a year. And it's not just because people smoke that much. It's all those other jobs and all those adders and all the possibility of added tourism. So you've got more bed and breakfast or Airbnb rentals now, and you'd have gas taxes, you'd have restaurants, and people joke, oh, because you're high, you'll eat more. But everyone eats every day. So if you have a tourist come to Vermont, they're going to eat a couple meals a day at restaurants. And we have a very proud state of our microbrew industry.
Absolutely.
And the $600 to $700 million industry, that is for Vermont, and all those jobs and secondary and tertiary jobs from that. And why we seem to embrace that, which I'm glad we do, and wouldn't want to embrace this as an additional opportunity for tourism, when frankly, while driving is an issue no matter what, it's actually, if we're on a scale of good to bad, it's less of an issue than it is with alcohol.
Absolutely.
And you want to talk about crime, I've asked lots of law enforcement, when was the last time you went to a domestic call where cannabis was the culprit as opposed to alcohol? And it's just night and day. So again, it's not that there's no harm in cannabis out there, but there's a lot of benefit, and it's also happening as it is today, but underground, unregulated, nobody knows the strength. So I think I've made my pitch, but.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you both, how can the community get involved in education or helping with getting access to resources to be able to help people like you guys actually get this push forward?
Well, I can do the political part. You can talk about the community part with respect to the businesses. I don't know.
Yeah, so, you know, I talk all day long about growing cannabis with people. You know, I'm a big proponent of knowing where your food comes from, and we should also know where our cannabis comes from, because we want to know what were the things that were used to grow it, were there pesticides used, things like that. And when you grow your own, you know, you have 100% control over that. You know, I eat all organic food for a reason, so I choose organic cannabis, and that's very important to me. So, you know, I teach people how to grow at home, and I do a lot of education around CBD as well. That's become a big part of what we do, and helping kind of break through the stigmas there. You know, and I think there's a lot that people can do politically. You know, and I was hoping, David, you might speak to, you know, how can the average citizen sort of get involved? You know, cannabis reform will be coming up in the new legislative session. You know, and we hope, and you know, depending on how the governor's race goes, you know, Governor Scott has not been the most supportive, and you know, you've been great at giving tips, I think, in the past for what can the average citizen do.
Well, I think there's a couple things. Certainly, your telling your story is a perfect example of one of the things people can do. There are a lot of folks that during these conversations, if you're a teacher, if you're an engineer, if you're a doctor, there's a lot of professions out there that the stigma made it so they couldn't come forth and say, yeah, you know, some nights I have a glass of wine and some nights I consume a little cannabis, and either way I wake up fine the next day and go to work and do a good job. But the stigma about people coming forth and talking about that is still very strong.
Yes.
I would argue probably with teachers more than anybody, even though what you do on your own time at home that doesn't affect your work the next day should not be a problem. But as more people tell their story, it makes more room for other people to tell the story.
Yes.
Because then it's not, oh, you're the one, oh, you're the weirdo, you're the this. I always go back to Arlo Guthrie and Alice's Restaurant. You know, if one person goes into a restaurant and sings a bar, Alice's Restaurant, they'll think you're crazy and throw you out. I don't even know if you know that song. But if 20 people a day or 50 people a day do it, then you know they'll think it's a movement. And the reality is more people telling their story is a piece of it. But also, if you don't want to tell your story publicly, you can still reach out to your own legislator. You can still reach out to them and say, you know, I'm not comfortable talking about this publicly because of the stigma, but I want to be a resource for you and tell you that this is what it's done for me. And that it isn't the devil thing that's being talked about or has been talked about for, you know, 60, 80, almost 90 years now. And so those conversations are critically important. And a lot of policymakers don't hear from their constituents on most issues nearly as much as I think they should. Right. The way that our democracy will function better is when more people's voices are included and not so much just the voices of the lobbyists and folks that are in the building paid by somebody else to be there all the time. Right. Lobbyists are good people, they're resources for information, but they're not the same as constituent phone calls, just talking about people's reality. And so that's what I would encourage.
And you know, I found that in, people in legislative, senators, whatever, that they're willing to listen. I mean, I've never been in a state, you know, well, I grew up in New Hampshire, but I lived in California most of the time. They're unapproachable, and moved to Vermont. And here's all these people that are willing to talk, to just pick up the phone and talk. And the power of sharing our stories and the power of being able to be a part of this moving first is to fight that stigma, to really understand, you know, that is going to make a difference, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I know we're into the time, so I wanted to get both of your messages, but I also want to make sure that people go out and vote. So we need to vote. We need to participate in our local government, and you know, decide what we want from you guys, because you listen. You listen.
Sure. And if I'll wrap my part briefly to say a couple things. In this part of the state, you've got 3 great state senators, Alice Nitka, Dick McCormick, and Allison Clarkson. And I get along great with Alice Nitka. I would say if folks want to friendly call her and have good conversations. She's a little more challenging on this topic. And she has a long history of working with kids with substance abuse and people with issues. So, so she's got that lens, and that's a fair lens to have. It's legitimate, but I think it's painted a broader picture on this topic that's been hard for her to get through. So people should contact her, and again, in a positive and respectful manner.
Yes.
You mentioned voting. I just want to put an appeal out to younger people.
Yeah.
Typically, in off-year elections, all ages vote less. But young people in both general, big election, presidential elections, and others, vote at about half to a third of the rate of other generations. And if people are feeling like there's a nightmare in the political world right now, which I certainly do, particularly at the national level, if the younger age group, 18 to 35 or 40, voted at the same rates as those of us who are in our 40s, 50s, 60s, and older, the nightmare would be over all across the country.
Yep.
Because the positions and issues of many people in that age group are more forward-thinking on some of these things and many others. So my appeal is to everybody out there, reach out to the 3 to 10 people in that demographic, along with other friends, and ask them if they're voting, ask them why they're not, or ask them what's important, and then point out why what's important to them could be affected by voting. We don't have to jam it down people's throat. Nobody likes things pushed down their throats. But these conversations over the next couple weeks, which by the time this airs may be over, is really a key piece of it. And once people start voting, they keep voting. So we would end the nightmare, and we would not return if that age group keeps voting.
Absolutely.
That's my words of wisdom. Anyway.
Yeah, you know, and I would say speak up. You know, if you use CBD or you are a cannabis user, share your story, like we've been talking about. There are a lot of people out there, and people are nervous to speak up, and there's been such a stigma for so many years, and we've been hammered with this propaganda for decades. And it's okay to talk about it. It's helpful. You know, we can help you grow your own, either THC cannabis or CBD, hemp, you know. You can grow your own CBD at home. So it doesn't have to be about getting high. It's so much more than that. And so I would echo, you know, what David said. Get out and vote. It is so very important.
If I could add one last piece, I don't know what our time limit is, but I've talked with some 13 and 15-year-olds, 13-year-old pages at the State House. And one of the big issues on this topic has been, what's the message to our youth? And what I have found is most effective at talking with youth about whether it's cannabis, tobacco, alcohol, or any number of substances, is that wait. And here's why. It is statistically shown that if you're in those high school years, maybe even a little bit older, and you expose your physiology to these drugs, any one of them, that later in life you are much more likely to become addicted to a drug.
Exactly,
Your body is still developing, your nerve endings and your receptors are still developing, and so that exposure early sets you on a path more likely later in life to have problems with any of these things. Whereas if you wait a little bit, then at some point in life you can have a glass of wine or you can have a little cannabis and so forth, and not have it trigger your body in the same way down a path towards addiction. So one of the things we have to do is also have these honest conversations with youth. And not just say, do this once, it will kill you. Well, that's just not true with cannabis. It's likely not true with alcohol unless you get behind a wheel and you don't know what you're doing and you've got too much. But the reality is, later in life, you'll have a much more successful life if you wait a little bit longer.
And being honest with children and not spreading propaganda that we've been told for decades.
That's
you know.
So I want to thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Linda.
What I did, she's a woman, say.
Of course. There's no hierarchy here. I'm all good.
No, I really do appreciate you coming to start this conversation, and I'm really encouraged there may be other people that come forward and maybe do their research and, you know, want to find out more about how they can be helpful. You know, because addiction is a big thing, and opiate addiction is bigger. Yeah, it's just unreal.
Yeah. We've all been touched somehow.
It's right.
And I certainly have close friends who have been impacted.
Yes. So make sure everybody out there votes.